Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. I want to start off apologizing for the fact that I am so sunburned because I was outside all week filming an event that happens in our city every year. So I will probably be sunburned every year at this time. So I just apologize for the fact that my face is so red. Hopefully it'll go away soon. Okay, so I left off last week talking about how I wanted to kind of get into how I grew up in an abusive household. So today I want to start off talking about my parents' relationship and kind of how they interact with each other and how that has affected me. So stay tuned for the rest of the video. Okay, so in the previous video, I talked about my parents kicking me out of the house. But I think I need to go back a little bit and talk about how my parents are with each other. Because I think a lot of the issues that I have personally that I've dealt with since moving out of their house, the problems that I seem to face in my personal relationships, I think stem a lot from the relationship that my parents have with each other. And so I think in order to understand them, we need to talk a little bit about the words that I'm going to be using to describe how my parents are with each other. So I think that a lot of people's parents argue. But my parents have especially heated arguments. They argue very frequently. It's a daily occurrence for them to argue with one another. I think it's become so common that they don't even realize that they're arguing all the time. That's how much they argue. So when I talk about arguing, it's kind of like high energy bickering, I guess. Yelling and storming out is a very real possibility. A lot of times my mom, when they have arguments, will get out of the car. Even if they're driving down the road, she'll open the door and she'll just take off walking. It's very common for them to argue. And so when I'm talking about arguing, that's what I'm talking about. There's yelling, there's screaming, storming off. It doesn't matter if it's public or private. But when I say arguing, that's what I mean. And when I say that they're fighting, fighting in terms of my parents is pretty much just everything short of a fist fight, basically. I've had my parents scratch each other, slap each other. There's always pushing and shoving. My mom has thrown my dad's clothes out on the lawn. So fighting is usually a word that I reserve for, I guess, when it becomes physical or if it lasts for a really extended period of time. So several hours, possibly days. If it came to the fact that somebody was spending the night at someone else's house or anything like that. So I'm just going to get right in. When I was really little, some of my earliest memories are of my parents fighting. I think that a lot of kids whose parents are, I guess, unstable, have a problem with not realizing that it's not normal. But I think on some level, I kind of always knew that my parents have an unbalanced relationship. I don't remember the neighbors ever having the cops called on them frequently, or seeing the neighbors scream in their front yard, or seeing the neighbors have them throw their clothes out on the front lawn or anything like that. So I think sometimes kids don't realize that their family life is abnormal. And I think maybe on some level I didn't realize that it was abnormal. But I think I kind of always knew that people weren't supposed to fight like that. And I think that I kind of always knew that it wasn't really something that you were supposed to be talking about, that it wasn't something to be proud of, that a lot of other people's parents didn't fight the way that my parents did. But I think that my earliest memory of my parents fighting, I was about, I would say between 1.5 and 2 years old. I remember being very small because the snippet of a memory that I have is only a few seconds long, but I remember standing on a concrete curb next to the road at nighttime with my father, and his car was parked right next to where we were standing, and I looked over at him, and I was about eye level with his knee. So I was very small. But the memory goes like, I'm standing there at night, kind of just listening to the nighttime noises on our street. And I remember looking up at my dad, and he was smoking a cigarette, which was very unusual. I remember thinking that it was very weird. I was fascinated by the way the smoke billowed. I hadn't spent any time around any smokers ever. We were all Jehovah's Witnesses, but at the time my dad was disfellowshipped and my parents were separated. So he was the only person that I knew that smoked. And it was fascinating to me to see someone smoking because I had never been up close to someone who was smoking cigarettes. And I remember standing there for a few moments before my mom came storming out of the house, and she was screaming and yelling about how my dad shouldn't be smoking cigarettes next to me. And she, walked really fast across the yard, and she grabbed me by my arm, and she lifted me up, and she carried me inside. And she slammed the door shut, and I guess my dad's visit ended. And that was very upsetting to me to have my dad yanked away from me, basically. Because, like I said, since they were separated, he wasn't living at the house. So, I only got to visit him every so often. So that's one of my earliest memories. It's not the earliest memory, but it is one of my very early memories of my parents. And I have a lot of memories of that happening. It's very strange because I don't remember a lot of really specific arguments because it was so common for them to fight about things. A lot of times I don't even remember what they were fighting about. They were always fighting, so it didn't really stick out in my mind. But I do remember a lot of times of my mom and my dad fighting about money. That was a big source of contention in our house. My dad was self-employed, and my mom worked, but not all the time. So we did have a lot of money problems growing up. We grew up very poor. We always had debtors calling us, trying to collect money from us. I remember answering the phone as a very small child, and telling debt collectors that my parents weren't home, even though they were. Because at the time, caller ID hadn't been invented yet. So, anybody could call at any time and you just picked up the phone. So you never knew if it was going to be a debt collector. So my parents had us answering the phones. I remember being on vacation, in another state, in a place we had never been before, an unfamiliar area, and my parents arguing in the car about directions, and my mom just opening up the door wherever we happened to be and just getting out and walking off. And we had no way of knowing where she was going or how long she was going to be gone. And cell phones were not a big thing back then, especially for a lower income family. So we just didn't really have any way of contacting her if she walked off. And it would have been a very long time before she got home. So we spent a lot of time driving around, trying to find where she was. And that was very upsetting as a small child. And I remember being very concerned for my mother's well-being because she would just get out of the car whenever she felt like it. And, that kind of thing happened pretty frequently. And it still happens frequently. My mom will still get out of the car if she's very upset at you. She will just open up the door, even if you're going down the interstate, and she'll just get out of the car. Now she has a cell phone so you can track her, but I mean, in the early 90s, there was no way to get in contact with somebody like that. It wasn't common for people to have cell phones back then. So, there was a lot of fights that my parents had that got physical. I remember when we were a little bit older, maybe when I was about a preteen or so, and before my oldest sister moved out of the house, there was a big argument, and we were in the living room. We had a door, our front door had a closet door on the corner that was where the front door was. And so there were two sets of hinges right there. And I remember a fight getting so heated and us trying to keep our mom from kicking our dad out of the house by kind of all pressing ourselves up against the front door. And I happened to be in the corner closest to the closet door, and because there was pushing and shoving going on, I got pushed up against the corner of the door, and I slid down, and I have a big scar on my back still from that event that happened. The scar is, probably 2 or 3 inches long. It's a pretty good sized scar. So, it wasn't uncommon for stuff like that to happen. In fact, I even have some letters that my mom wrote me. I have several of them, but one of them is a couple of them are pretty telling. It got so bad that when my parents would argue, occasionally, maybe once or twice a year, there would be such a big argument that my mom would feel regretful of that. And she would write us letters, cards, whatever, apologizing for how she acted. So I have a couple of those letters here with me, so I'm going to go ahead and read one. So this is a card that my mom wrote to me. It doesn't have a date on it, so I'm not sure what year it was written. But it was when we were living in Clovis, so it was the 90s for sure. I'm not sure what year it was, but I was obviously old enough to be reading and understanding some of these bigger words. So I would say I was probably at least 8 years old and maybe older. So somewhere between 8 and 13. They're not all numbered, like I said, so I can't really be specific on what time it was. But let me go ahead and read this one. This one says, "Dear Jojo," that's what my family calls me. "Thank you for being understanding. Please forgive us for yesterday. I know it wasn't fun to listen to, and we apologize. We will try to make some changes for the better so it won't happen again. Signed, Love, Mom and Dad," and then their names underneath there. It was obvious that my mom was the one who signed both of the names because this is all in her entire handwriting. But this was something that, at the time, it wasn't super common to get these, but I did end up getting enough of them that after a while, kind of became white noise, and it stopped being unexpected and pleasant, and it was just kind of, Mom wrote us another apology letter, and so I didn't save all of them, but I do have a few of them. But when she got particularly upset, she would write you an apology letter. But the problem is that after a while, it stopped seeming genuine because she does it all the time. I have another letter of hers that she wrote me, another card that she wrote me after she got really upset at me. I don't remember this particular instance, but I do have a letter pertaining to it. And we got yelled at quite a bit, so it wasn't something that stood out in my mind, I guess. But to her, it did, because she did end up writing me an apology note. But apparently what had happened is that our family threw a garage sale, and she, I guess, had gotten upset at me and wasn't letting me help. So this one was written to me when I was a teenager. I'm going to go ahead and read that one too. It says, "Dear Johanna, I just wanted to say thank you for helping out so much with the garage sale. I know I don't always let you know just how much you mean to me, but I just wanted this note to reflect the love and appreciation I have for you. I think the next couple of months are going to be hard on all of us, and I appreciate your willing attitude to help and give of yourself. Thanks for being a great teenager and a special human being." So, it's nice to feel appreciated by your parents, but I think that after an event such as yelling at your kid for trying to help out, it seems more like you're apologizing because you're expected to apologize, especially since she kind of set that precedent herself, more than the fact that she was really apologetic. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how that affected me personally, that my parents argued so much. So when I first started dating my husband, we were living together pretty quickly after. Within a month of dating, I was living in the same house as him. We weren't sharing a bedroom and everything right away, but I was living in the same house with him and his parents when we first started dating. And it was, I think, July 9th of 2005 when we moved in together. And then we got engaged in September, at the end of September that same year. So it was only about 3 months, not even 3 months, between the time we started living together and the time that we got engaged. So from observance, my parents argued so much that I wasn't really aware that you could have a conversation and disagree about something without it becoming an argument. I had never seen people disagree peacefully. Every argument with my parents turns into a yelling match. So, or if it doesn't turn into a yelling match, it definitely seems as if there's some sort of resentment there, which there always is. So it was quite confusing. I also wasn't aware that when you were mad at someone, that didn't mean that you stopped loving them. Because when my parents argued, they never apologized politely in front of us. It was never like, I disagree with you and I'm mad at you, but I still love you. It was never a loving attitude. It was always very hateful. So I guess that kind of got ingrained in me to think that when you were mad at someone, you didn't love them. And I struggled with that for a long time within my own relationships because with my mom, when she gets upset, it's like it's the maddest she's ever been in her entire life. And I still struggle with that. Every time I get angry, it's as if I'm the most upset I've ever been. And I think the difference is a recognition that that's what you're doing and a willingness to change that behavioral pattern, to recognize that you're the problem. But I think that since my mom has narcissistic personality disorder, and she hasn't been diagnosed with anything, that she doesn't have a willingness to recognize that she is the common denominator in all of these problems. So when I was first with my husband, I did carry a lot of those same traits. I didn't realize that it was inappropriate to scream at someone in public. That if you were mad, it's okay to just say whatever you want to say and act however you want to act. It took a long time for me to curb those behaviors in myself and not act that way. And I am ashamed to say that I did act that way a lot when I was a lot younger. And that's something that I have really had to work on to change in myself. I guess speaking to my parents' relationship, when I was a kid and I talked with other kids at school about their parents, it seemed to me that the kids that I related to the most were kids who had parents that were either about to get a divorce or already divorced. It seemed like my parents had a similar relationship to their parents, and my parents had a lot of the same habits that their parents had. And so I think that when I was a kid, I kind of always expected my parents to get a divorce. And it really came as a surprise to me when I was an adult and there were no more of their kids living at home. It really came as a surprise to me that my parents didn't get a divorce. And I know that sounds very strange, but if you spent enough time around my parents, you can see that they really struggle with compatibility issues. And I don't know really what that stems from, but it seems as if, at least outwardly, around other people, that they're not very compatible. Now, I don't know how they are behind closed doors, but I think that that's another thing I want to comment on too, is that when my parents would argue in front of us, even to the point of acting like they were going to get a divorce, telling each other that they didn't want to be together anymore in front of us, that I never got to see the resolution of the fight, which I think is really important. So I don't really even know to this day how my parents settle arguments. I'm not sure who caves. I'm not sure who apologizes. I'm not even sure if there are apologies at this point, because I've never seen my parents apologize to each other. So I think that it's really important when you have kids to let them see your faults. And it's okay to argue in front of your kids if you're capable of keeping it civil. But that also, if you're going to fight in front of your kids, that you need to allow them to see the resolution of the argument too. Because I think that it's really important for your kids to learn how to disagree, but also how to solve problems and still remain civil. If you're going to be arguing in front of your kids, you need to be able to keep it civil so that you can set a good example for them in the future. I don't know if I've said this before or not, but I was a nanny for years. So even though I don't have kids, I have a lot of experience dealing with children. And kids pick up on everything that you do in front of them. So I think that it's really important to set that example. I think you can go wrong both directions. If you never argue in front of your kids, they never get to see that that's normal to have a disagreement. But if you fight too much in front of your kids, they think that fighting is normal. So I think that it's important to fight in front of your kids as long as you can keep it civil so they can learn from your example on how to communicate even though you're angry, and how to come to a resolution if there is a disagreement. And I feel like that's something that I missed out on as a kid because I never got to see a resolution with my parents. I only saw arguing and I never saw resolution. So from my point of view, what I got to see was fighting one day, and then the next day or over the next couple of days, it was as if nothing happened. It was appropriate to ignore that there was ever a fight in my household. And for a long time, that's kind of how I wanted to deal with fighting. I wanted people to forget that I was upset at them, that I said things that were inappropriate. But I mean, I had to unlearn those bad habits. So if anybody else is struggling with that similar thing of trying to figure out how to have relationships, I think that if I were to do it over again, I would probably seek therapy, because I think that that would be a good way to help you work out whatever's going on inside your head, kind of help you figure out what inside your head isn't proper. Because I think that we all have things that we can work on. Nobody was raised perfect. Nobody is perfect. So I think that it's important that we recognize our faults and we're willing to try to work on them. So I'm going to talk a little bit more in the next video about similar issues. So just stay tuned for some more of my videos, and I will catch you guys next time.